Hello from Sojourn Psychology. It is Tara Boothby. I am a registered psychologist in the province of Alberta, and today I am going to talk about toxic relationships. Toxic relationships is really a common topic in therapy, I'd say. I think also just as people. There are times when each one of us evaluates our relationships. Is this a good relationship or a bad relationship? And we want to make sense of what are the markers of good relationships, high quality relationships, those relationships I prefer, the relationships I can maintain, the relationships that I like, and then we evaluate the relationships that are difficult to maintain or I don't like. And we want to see the problematic features of what are toxic relationships. Now, this is not always that easy because there's a variety of toxic relationships. Two main categories, I would say, is that at times we can be in a healthy relationship, and there's a situational time frame of toxicity. And I mean, I've experienced this, I'm sure many of you have too, where we have really great relationship with somebody and then we go through just a season where it doesn't feel as emotionally safe for some reason. That could be life transition, it could be grief and loss, somebody could be struggling with a mental health situation or a car accident, or just developmental shifts with children, life changes. There can be these times where a relationship is a bit toxic for a while, but that does not mean the entire relationship is toxic. And maybe when we evaluate that situation of what feels toxic, we realize, okay, I don't even want to call that a toxic relationship, but it was a rough patch or something like that. Now, even though it can be a shorter duration of toxicity, it can be quite serious. When somebody's in real distress, they could be all types of abusive or inappropriate. So again, even when we're talking about the situational toxicity, there's different levels or types or ways that we need to evaluate that. Now, more chronic or long-term toxic relationships are very interesting as well. Again, there's a variety of types of toxicity. When it's more chronic toxic relationships, usually there's some abusive features, so that could be psychological, emotional, physical, sexual, spiritual, which is a huge one. Lots of spiritual abuse is so toxic, and I feel like I missed one of the types of abuse, but there's usually some abuse features. So sometimes it's more readily seen that this is abuse. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, it can be more readily seen. Things like psychological and spiritual abuse can be more subtle. They can be harder for us to notice. And so that's why I think as well, when we're in a good relationship or a bad relationship, it's really common for us to try and analyze and think of or notice the themes of like what makes a bad relationship. And it's not a bad idea to evaluate when a relationship has failed. However, toxic relationships can look very, very different. And I will say that a toxic relationship is intoxicating, just like an intoxicating relationship is also intoxicating. It sounds fancy, but how I make sense of that is that the good relationships are intoxicating. So there's an intoxicating environment where we are intoxicated by it. If you've had a good mentor, a good teacher, if you've read a really great book, you've watched a great movie, there's these healthy markers of something that you've experienced. You've had an intoxicating experience. An intoxicated environment or situation has intoxicated us in a good way. But toxic relationships are also intoxicating. And actually, when I meet people who are in a toxic relationship or they're coming out of it, they can almost feel drunk off of it. Like, affect could appear muted. Denial is often a common marker. They might list some of these behaviors that sound very, very dangerous. Somebody's manipulating them, taking advantage of them, hypercritical name calling, even physically or sexually aggressive towards them, and the person is quite muted about it. So that's what I mean when I say toxic relationship is intoxicating. And that's why it's really hard for us to see when we're in the really, really, really bad relationships. It can take quite a while to see it. An old stat is that it takes an abuse victim 7 times to leave an abusive marriage. So if you are concerned for a toxic relationship, or you know you're in a toxic relationship, go easy on yourself. It's hard to leave. And just right now, I have a thought. Oftentimes when I normalize this with clients who are in a bad relationship, an abusive relationship, the cycle of abuse is such that there's a buildup. So people who are abusers can be quite charming, and so there's a buildup of toxicity, and there's a ramp up of inappropriate behavior, and then there'll be an explosive abusive situation. But after the big explosive abusive situation, oftentimes comes the honeymoon. So it's hard to leave when things are good. The cycle is such for toxicity or abuse that this is so bad, but then it's amazing. So it's okay to notice that it can be hard to see toxic relationships. There's often some really good benefits or high qualities of a toxic relationship, and then there's the pain and the discomfort and the distress of the abuse. But it's such a system of power over an individual that a person really, really typically loses sight of actually the mistreatment that's going on. So again, when I'm talking with clients, and even for myself, evaluating relationships, a great question that I like to ask is, do I like myself in this relationship? If we want to evaluate relationships, it's not always about noticing problematic stuff with other people. Are they an abusive person? People love to try and figure out who's a narcissist right now. It's interesting to try and evaluate other people. I actually don't know if we can stop ourselves from trying to make sense of other people, especially if they've hurt us. But it is more profound and powerful to look inside and to evaluate our internal environment. Relationships are external that impact our internal environment, and our internal environment also fuels relationships. So for me, I want to consider, do I like myself in this relationship? I also find that's interesting with, sometimes I've had really, really great relationships, and then there's a situational time where I don't really love myself in that relationship. Didn't really work for me for those 2 weeks or whatever it was. And so sometimes we can return back to a good place with people, and sometimes we just, move on, because if it gets bad, we might just not really find our way back to closeness with people. So we can change our minds about relationships, and we can also maintain relationships with people who are a bit toxic for us with boundaries. There's all these different ways. It's not a clear shot. We don't have to cut everybody off, and we don't have to invite everybody in all the time either. Being out of relationship is always uncomfortable, so we want to try and maintain relationships whenever possible. However, if we really, really cannot live with integrity and spiritually at peace with ourselves in a relationship, that might be a time when we have to terminate a relationship or create immense amount of space so that we can have any sort of connection with that person. If you've been abused, it's probably best not to have a relationship with your abuser. Some people find a way, but it's not usually possible. So I think that as well, when we're evaluating relationships and whether we can find our footing to maintain a relationship, maybe we can repair the toxicity, maybe we can't. It also is important to remember that endings are always hard. Endings are hard, and we respond really according to our internal environment. So if you lose your footing and you're struggling to like who you are in a relationship, it's going to be harder to regulate your internal environment, and then how you respond to the ending is going to be more emotion based. Sometimes people have to leave angry. Sometimes people have to not like you, or sometimes you just have to really stop a conversation. Sometimes we can find a way to amicably move on from a toxic relationship. Like it's always surprising to see how unique each relationship is, even though there are always nuances of similarity, because we're attachment beings and we all just long for relationship. And so we move into a relationship or we move out of a relationship, we cue for our needs or we miscue to higher needs. We do things similarly as people, but relationships are always quite unique. And evaluating your relationships is good. If you're concerned that you're in a toxic relationship, I think talking to somebody whom you trust that sees you in that relationship could be helpful to get their opinion. And it's always good to talk to a mental health professional and to just run it past somebody else, because you are valuable, and toxic relationships just really aren't good for us. And it's just unfortunate, but it's a true part of being human, that sometimes relationships fail us. Okay, you guys, I really hope that you can like who you are in your life, and I hope that you can like who you are in all of your relationships. And I really hope that if you don't like who you are in a relationship or in your life, that you can take courage to find your footing, to regulate your internal environment, and to evaluate in your external environment those things that are working for you and those things that aren't. And at any time we can change our mind. So just because we've committed to one path, maybe it's to a person, a marriage, a religion, a job, we can change our minds. That's allowed. Okay, so we're so glad that you're here, and we will just keep continuing this mental health conversation with the themes and the important topics that we are talking about with colleagues and with clients. Peace and love.